about widows and virgins and so on. So he deals with all these things down through chapter 7. It's one of the longer chapters at 40 verses here. So we'll begin to dig through it tonight. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 16 is the most controversial portion of this chapter, if not maybe of the book, among brethren, as they have different views and ideas about it. But we have to remember to respect the context of chapter 7 here. Chapter 7 does not contradict the rest of Scripture. It is not against anything that Jesus said or anything that Paul or anybody else wrote anywhere else. It can be reconciled through thoughtful examination, reflection on what's written, consideration of what is written elsewhere. And we do not want to stretch it beyond its original intent. We can't assume or imply something that is not in here. And one of the things I think that's worth noting as you look at this is, particularly in verses 1 through 16, remarriage is not discussed whatsoever. It's not addressed at all. So to put that in here is to put something in there that doesn't belong. That's out of the context. So let's look at this first section, verses 1 through 7, where Paul deals with obligations in marriage. So 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 7. Who's got this? Go ahead, Ron.
Now concerning the things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, likewise, also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that.
All right. So first thing he brings up is what they had written him about. Is it good for a man not to touch a woman? Some translations have that in quotes. Other translations do not. But the issue underlying all of this in this section here is, should we abstain from sexual relations altogether? Is that the path of holiness and righteousness and purity for a Christian? Well, when he mentions this, what do we know about marriage? What do we know about God's will concerning marriage, just generally speaking throughout the Bible?
Well, we know that it was ordained by God. We know that God had purposed for a man to have a woman as it was in the beginning with Adam and Eve, and that she was a suitable helpmate for him because there was not that found which to be suitable for him. So it is something God ordained and God purposed. So as you mentioned, Stephen, we don't look at this in exclusion to everything else.
Exactly. And when he put Adam and Eve together, what did he command and what did Moses note about that relationship?
Well, that it was a sacred relationship and it involves procreation, the continuation of life.
Okay, yeah, be fruitful, multiply. Right. The two become one flesh. And so he designed man and woman for each other, and he intended and purposed for them to come together as husband and wife in a sexual relationship. Anything else in the Bible we know about what he writes? Okay, so that's one of the things I had down, Ephesians 5:22 down to 33, where he likens the husband-wife relationship to Christ's church relationship. And what that shows us is the Lord's high value that he places on the husband and the wife, even though he's really talking about Christ and the church in that section, as Paul notes. When he gives the analogy of husband-wife, what that's saying is this is a good and proper relationship that God approves of. He endorses marriage in Hebrews 13:4. Talks about fornicators and adulterers God will judge, but he says the marriage bed is pure and undefiled. And so God endorses that relationship. He endorses that activity within marriage. Any other thoughts? Ron, then John, then Nancy?
In Proverbs, we read, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord."
Exactly. It's hard to get much more of a ringing endorsement than that, right? Just explicitly stated, John?
And also in Proverbs chapter 5, when the writer warns about adultery, the answer to that is the physical intimacy of the marriage relationship, but also the Song of Solomon is basically a whole book based on that. It's the physical intimacy between a man and a wife in a marriage relationship. But that's the answer to not committing adultery.
Okay. Nancy?
So I was going to say, from the beginning of time until all time, elders are required to have wives. God required that in order for them to be qualified. They also have to have children, but so the relationship is important to God.
Yes.
He's a woman at all through all time.
Yes, and not only married, but he has to have children. Faithful, believing children, but children. Deacons have to have children as well. So, exactly right. And if you remember in 1 Timothy chapter 4, that he explicitly writes there that it's a doctrine of demons to forbid marriage. Now, of course, that's qualified those who are authorized, qualified to be married, who have the right to be married. But it definitely teaches that marriage is good and right and proper and healthy and wholesome for a man and woman. So when he talks about for a man not to touch a woman, of course, that's a euphemism there for that physical intimacy, for the relationship that is reserved for a husband and a wife. And so Paul brings up this issue there, and beginning there in verse 2, he says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality. So in the first part, he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And we're going to see all the way down through here that this is in light of something he mentions later in verse 26. There's a present distress. So there's a modifier in some of the things that he says here. And also understanding these are things, in some of this, he notes, hey, this is my recommendation. It's not a commandment. And it's very clear as we go through here. Ron, do you have something else?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So he says, because of sexual immorality, verse 2, let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. Any observation on that?
Well, that also fits the pattern. One man, one woman for life. It's that bond, and that's what we see described here.
Okay, each have his own wife. Each woman have her own husband. Singular in those, one man and one woman.
I don't want to go too far, but do you think that when he says have, that he's talking about to be intimate with them? Just like the man had his own mother-in-law, he was intimate with her. Well, he's saying here, a man needs to be intimate with his wife, and a woman needs to be intimate, and that's what that have means there, not just have a wife or have a husband. It means you need to be intimate.
Yes, and it spells it out very explicitly as he gets down a little bit further. And so he is talking about this relationship because he's just talked about touch, and now he's talking about have, own wife, own husband. that is ordained of God. So you have this relationship in which sexual desires are to be fulfilled. And my question and question number one was, is marriage merely a preventative to fornication? Explain. Is that the only purpose? Mike mentioned it a moment ago. What else is it, Mike? For companionship. Okay. Anybody want to add to that? You're there to help bear the burdens of life together, to deal with difficulties. You're there together to raise children together, because children, in an environment where they have a mother and a father, particularly where they believe in the Lord and serve the Lord, that's the best environment for children to grow up in. And I know there's some cases where tragically that doesn't happen, but that's God's design. That's what the ideal situation is. And we need to appreciate that. So, yes, there is this element of preventing fornication, but it is more than simply that. John?
We have a blessing of children that's in there, making it through the difficulties of life. But also in this, change the subject, you also have prohibitions here, two men being together, two women being together, or having more than one mate, because everything's singular here, and it's a man and a wife only. That's the only thing that's described by God in the Bible.
Okay, yeah, exactly right. And this is a change we know, of course, from the law of Moses, where they were permitted to have multiple wives. And here he's very plain and explicit in pointing out one man and one woman. That's God's intent. Well, husbands and wives are obligated to render affection to one another in verses 3 and 4. And of course, affection is a euphemism for that physical intimacy. Question number 2, what does it mean that a wife has authority over the husband's body and vice versa?
Revolutionary what he's saying here. During that time you had, the husband that was always in possession of the body, not necessarily the woman, but here he shows him very much equal footing and standing in this relationship of sexuality.
Exactly right. Marriage laws, historically, especially in ancient times, very much favored the man. And there were some cases where women essentially had no rights whatsoever. And here in the gospel system, we're seeing that equality, that respect of both the husband and the wife, the man and the woman in this relationship. They're put on equal terms here. Any other thoughts on that?
It certainly was a turnaround from where he would have been in his Jewish thinking. If he were still a practicing Jew, that would not have been the statement that he would have ever made.
Exactly right. Men had much more rights under the law of Moses. So here, talking about this rendering the affection and so on. So what is that idea of having authority over the other's body?
It's ownership. They don't have any right to use that body with any other person in that kind of a relationship.
Right.
You have full authority of how that body is used in a sexual nature.
And any other aspect to that, Mike? Right, and we'll hit on that a little more in verse 5. One of the things is you have the right to their body. Remember, he began with verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. The question is, should Christians practice abstinence? Should they be celibate to be holy and pure and free from the world and everything like that? And one of the things he's pointing out here is you need to render the affection to the wife to the husband. Both, you need to respect that. You have authority. You have the right to their body. that is within the sphere of what God permits, allows, authorizes. And as Nancy was saying, no one else has that right. No one has the right to claim the husband, to claim the wife in any way. So here he's establishing this is a good relationship that's under the authority of God. You have full rights in this. And so then that question number 3 with verses 5 and 6 there, under what conditions does Paul say abstinence in marriage is permissible? What's he dealing with here? What's he talking about? Verse 5.
He's talking about a mutual decision between the husband and the wife that they are going to commit themselves to prayer and fasting. So there's a specific reason that they go into this with an identified purpose, and also it's not open-ended. There's a conclusion to the matter.
Okay. All right. So this idea here, he says, do not deprive one another. And that idea of deprive there is the word that means defraud or to rob or to despoil. So if you are depriving your spouse, you are defrauding them, you are robbing them, you're stealing something that is rightfully theirs. And so he says, as Ron was pointing out, there is a period of time that you give yourself to spiritual things. Now, some translations don't have fasting in there because the underlying textual evidence questions whether or not that belongs, but whether it's there or not there, the idea of giving yourselves to prayer is there, universally recognized, and it's just simply saying you give yourselves to more spiritual concentration, thought, and activity. So, what's the condition here? Or maybe what's the condition not?
It's not open-ended, so it's an agreed upon spiritual reason, and then the result of it is coming back together.
Okay, so there's a mutual agreement for a period of time, a limited period of time. Anything else?
I think it was mentioned before that some people use sex as a weapon. They're mad at their spouse about something, and so they're just get away from it.
Right. They may be mad about something, and so they deprive them, or they may be wanting something and depriving them until they get what they want. It's used as coercion and manipulation. So he's saying you can't do that. That's against God's will here. And one of the things is when he says, do not deprive one another except with consent, giving yourself to these things, understand that this is the only place in the Bible where it talks about being, if you will, separated from one another for a period of time, physically not coming together as husband and wife. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit because I think some people have misunderstandings about that. Go ahead.
It also shows that in marriage there should be an aspect of devotion to God as well. And that you have to take time for that. There has to be good balance in your marriage.
Well, and to your point there, verse 6, he says, I say this as concession, not by commandment. He's not commanding that you have to do this, that you have to abstain. Spiritual things most definitely are part of that marriage. The husband and wife are to be working together and serving God. That's one of the great purposes of husband and wife, to be there for each other and serving the Lord and working and laboring in the kingdom. But he's trying to clarify for them, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, I'm not commanding you that you have some type of regimented thing, monthly you have to do this. So he wants to be clear about that. And here's one of the things out of verse 5 that we need to understand is couples need to think about this when one or the other of them takes a job that requires travel. Well, how much travel, how much time are you going to be apart? Because I know there's some jobs where men will go, and I suppose some women will, but like oil fields, they might go out for 30 days or 90 days at a time. Well, is that wise? Is that healthy for that marriage relationship? Sometimes it is that one or the other goes to care for a family member. Well, how long is that going to be? Is that going to create an issue within that marriage? And other situations that may come up, but husbands and wives both need to be thinking about that, because Paul says here, look, don't deprive each other because Satan will come along and tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So it's a very real issue that husbands and wives need to work out so that they remain committed and faithful to one another. Any other thoughts there? Verse 7 then. He says, I wish all men were even as I myself. What's he talking about there?
I think he's talking about being single.
Hey, being single and being celibate. Exactly right. So, again, we're going to see when we get down further into this, verse 26 talks about because of present distress. There's something going on as he's writing this to them that he's saying, hey, right now, here are better conditions. Here's what I would advise you to do. And so he's bringing one of those things out here. I wish they could be. Each one has his own gift, one in this manner, another in that. So one of the things he's acknowledging is different people have different levels of desires and passions. And there are some who being single, being celibate is just not going to work. And they need to marry. Each man have his own wife. Each woman have her own husband to avoid that sexual immorality. While others, they can deal with that and they can remain single and everything will be fine. So Paul says, I wish everyone was like me, but I know that's not the reality of it. Not everyone is like me. So verses 8 and 9, who will read that for us? 1 Corinthians 7, 8 and 9. Go ahead, Philip.
But I say to the unmarried and to the widow, to them they remain even as I am. That they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Okay. So question 4, I did ask, why did Paul recommend celibacy here? Who's he addressing? What's going on?
As you said before, if there's some kind of persecution or something going on, he just, felt like the ones that aren't married or anything should remain that way. And also because, as he says later on, when you're single, you have more time to devote to God. You're not worried about the other person, what they need, and making a living, having to worry about, taking care of dependents and all that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Exactly right. So there are people who are never married. There are people who were married, but they lost their spouse. So you might think of it this way, but I say to the unmarried and especially to the widows, perhaps it's that way, but it's good for them. They remain single, they remain celibate, but if they can't exercise self-control, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to do what? Okay, yeah. If that's something that you can't keep a lid on, then you need to make sure that you take care of that per God's will, according to His way. All right, now let's dig into the more controversial portions of this. Let's read 10 and 11, please. Who will read 10 and 11? Go ahead, Carter.
Now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife.
Okay, so I asked you to compare these two verses with Matthew 19, 1 through 9, note how the parallels between them and how they fit together, because Paul makes note here, now, to the married I command, not I, but the Lord. So he's saying the Lord addressed this. The Lord taught about this. So let's go back to Matthew 19, and let's read 1 through 9 here. Just note the context of this exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees here. Let's get 3 through 9. I think that'll do us. 3 through 9. Who'll read that for us? Go ahead, John.
And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give certificate of divorce and to send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery."
All right. So, looking at these two passages, what are the parallels? How do they fit together?
They see the permanence of marriage. It is a lifelong commitment. It's not taken lightly. It is something that's sanctioned by God. Divorce is not sanctioned by God.
Okay. Any other thoughts to add to that? All right, so the Lord said, Matthew 19:6, what God has joined together, let not man separate. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10, a wife is not to depart from her husband. Verse 11, the last part, a husband is not to divorce his wife. So, do not separate and do not part, do not divorce is the same thing. And it talks here about, if you will, put the first part of verse 11, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 11, in parentheses. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried to be reconciled to her husband. That's dealing with what happens if a divorce takes place. Well, in Matthew 19:9, he says, unless the divorce is for sexual immorality, you marry another, you're committing adultery. And that's why he says you have to remain unmarried. If for whatever reason, and he doesn't give reasons as to why a wife here has departed or the husband has departed, he's just saying, look, you're not to do it. If it happens so, you have to remain unmarried or be reconciled to your spouse. Now, the word depart here is chorizo, and that means separate and asunder. That's the same as the Matthew 19:6 where it says, let not man separate. So we understand this. When it says depart, it's talking about divorce. It's talking about separating from your spouse in that manner of divorce. Now, here's what I mentioned a while ago. In our modern legal system, there's a thing called separation. The Bible does not teach that. Sometimes people say, well, I can separate as long as I don't divorce. Well, that's not in the Bible. So we need to shove that language aside and just go by what the Bible talks about here. Wife is not to depart from her husband. If she does, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to the husband. And the same rule applies to the husband. Again, getting back to what Mike mentioned a while ago about there's equality. Both of them have certain responsibilities. They have certain duties. It's not just one-sided, but this applies to both the husband and the wife. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. So, he's not dealing with the case of adultery. Let's understand that in verses 10 and 11. Because if he was, then Matthew 19:9 comes into play, and you can depart. You can divorce your spouse and go and marry another. The innocent party in that situation has that right. The guilty party does not have that right. All right, so verses 12 to 16. Who's got that for us? 12 to 16. Go ahead, Ron.
But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?
Okay. So, question number 6 is, what specific case had Jesus not discussed in his teaching on marriage and divorce?
Someone who becomes a Christian while they're married, and their spouse is not, they're still outside.
Okay. So, he's very clear in making this distinction. To the rest, I, not the Lord. He's not saying the Lord does, the authority of the Lord is not behind this. That's not what he's saying. He says, look, the Lord did address this situation, but he didn't address this one. And he's simply dealing with what happens when a Christian finds themselves married to an unbeliever. What are they to do about it? So what would the situation be at Corinth that may have applied, I don't know, to 50% of the congregation? I don't know. 20%? 70%? Of those who are married, that is. What do we know about Corinth, Paul's time at Corinth? Where did he go? Who did he talk to? John?
Well, we know that people at that time had household gods. So if you had a man and a woman that were married, the woman was expected to worship her husband's household god.
Yes. And they thought nothing of that. Like her family would not be upset, okay, where Apollo, is that one, was your family god. Now Zeus is your family god with your husband. They were totally fine with that. Go ahead, John.
Well, that happens.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, but why is it that they were okay with it? That if the wife married into the family and adopted new gods, why do they not go to war with each other over that? Philip?
They were polytheistic society, so they believed technically that they were all gods. It was just which one do you choose to worship? Because technically to them they were all gods. They could all be worshipped. And many times they worshiped more than one entity.
Okay, exactly. Just who's the chief one in our family? Who's the one we really identify with or look to? You know, you could see somebody who has a merchant sailing family that they might worship Poseidon or Neptune, I guess is the other. You know, that might be the one because their livelihood depends on that. Their safety depends on that. And so they consider them all to be deities. And you know what? If you want to worship one versus the other, who cares? Doesn't matter. So they didn't have any issues with that. But what happens when the wife becomes a Christian, or let's say the husband becomes a Christian and the wife doesn't?
He's going to have a complete change of lifestyle and thinking. And so he's going to say there's only one God, and she's going to be like, what? Where did this come from? What did you get into here? You know?
And what what's that Christian going to tell their spouse about their soul?
Yeah, they're lost. They're going to be judged at the end of their, when they die, and they're going to go to heaven or hell. Right now, they're going to be going to hell.
Right.
It's, it would be a real traumatic thing for a married couple in a situation like that. For the spouse that's not a Christian, they'd be like, what on earth is going on here? Plus, if it was the husband that became Christian, then he'd be saying to the wife, I am the authority here, and I'm the spiritual leader, here, and I can't have you worshiping these gods, in our house.
Mm-hmm. And you think about in that situation, things that they had permitted in their house before, one or the other probably strongly objects to now and voices that very directly to their spouse. Well, what do you mean we can't have our friends over and have a feast of Bacchus anymore? What are you talking about? Why are you not? Why won't you go with me to the idols temple now? This is something our family has done as a tradition for 100 years. What is wrong with? So you can see that conflict coming up between them. But even if it's not a pagan, Paul preached at the synagogue. And there would have been some Jews who you could see in that family, one becomes a Christian, the other doesn't. And that's going to cause just as many, if not more, hard feelings.
Probably more.
Because, you're following this false prophet, Jesus of Nazareth. He was crucified. He's a criminal. And now you're doing that. Well, you don't believe Moses, do you? And you can see that great tension and divide in that home. And so their question evidently is, do we need to get away from these people? Should we divorce them? Because this isn't good here. Philip.
This is still applicable today because you have many brethren coming out of denominations, and you'll have the same split, the same justifications. Well, we've done it this way for 100 years. Why? What? I mean, we both worship the same Jesus. This passage is still applicable today.
Absolutely, Mike.
First of all, Jesus didn't mention this because he was dealing primarily with Jews. This becomes I won't say a new issue, but an issue because Christianity is much broader and brings in much more cultural differences in families in Jewish people. But one of the things that we were just talking about with denominations, that is extremely hard. It would be easier for me if you had a non-believing who didn't believe anything than an atheist, that you had to kind of teach them, there's some reasoning that can kind of go on there. However, when you've got someone that you know is wrong and they really feel like they're following God, then it becomes an emotional tie that has to be untied, and that can be extremely difficult.
Yeah.
No,
I've known of cases where being married to an atheist, agnostic, whatnot, humanist perspective, there's a lot of tensions there. There's sometimes little shared moral values, whereas a denomination person may have a shared moral value. So each of them come with their own set of problems. But like you say, it's very insulting for someone who says they believe in Jesus to be told, yeah, I know you believe in him, but you're not obedient to him. And there's an issue there. So you're not right. That's a tough thing. Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, let's discuss 14.
How about we wait on 14?
Okay.
Very good. Very good. The point I want to get to here is under the law of Moses, they were told they were not to marry the people of the land of Canaan. That was sinful because those pagans would lead their children away from the Lord. So don't give your daughters to their sons and don't take their daughters for your sons. Okay? When you get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, remember there were those who had married pagan women, and they are told, Ezra 10, Nehemiah 13, you have to put them away and their children. And so you can understand why there would be some people at Corinth thinking, oh, I am now a Christian, I'm a child of God, and my spouse is not. My spouse is a pagan or whatever. I need to separate from them because that's an unholy alliance between me and this person who worships false gods. So Paul has to deal with this because he needs to help them understand what is your duty and your obligation. So 12 and 13, he says, that you need to stay with your spouse. If she's willing to live with him, verse 12, let him not divorce her. A woman who has a husband doesn't believe. If he's willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now, the context does not authorize that if they are in their second or third marriage that is unlawful, that means they stay with them. He's not even touching on that right here. He's just simply saying, based on one being an unbeliever, the other a believer, doesn't justify or compel you in any way to get a divorce. That's not right. Do not get a divorce over that. They're willing to live with you. They're content with that. You need to stay married. Now, verse 14, Paul, what do you want to discuss?
Well, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, they would be unclean. Okay. But they now are holy.
All right. So, it again goes back to that Ezra, Nehemiah, Old Testament law, Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, where it talks about the fact that being married to these people, you're in an unholy, unclean relationship. And what Paul is simply pointing out here is that doesn't apply any longer. And your marriage is sanctified. Your marriage is acceptable in the sight of God. Your children are acceptable in the sight of God. They're not unclean because you're married to a pagan. So your marriage is good, it's holy, and it's right before God. That's all that he's saying. Remember in 1 Peter chapter 3 where it talks about a woman who has a husband who won't be won by the word, without a word may be won by the conduct of the wife. So there's another case in the New Testament where it says there's a believer and an unbeliever married to each other, and one is dragging their feet and stubborn and doesn't want to submit, but the wife's conduct can help to bring them around to be open to accepting Christ and submitting to his will. So he's saying the marriage is good. It's just a way of saying the marriage is good. Mike.
I think there's also an aspect the blessings that come to Christians. Everyone in that household is blessed because of that person. And that's why it's important that if you are married to an unbeliever, that you remain faithful, because if you truly love them, the blessings that God's giving you extends upon them as well.
It will be a benefit and a blessing to them, and that's the only hope of really bringing them around. And we'll talk more about that aspect in just a moment. Any other thoughts before we get to 15, 16? All right, so 15, 16, where he says, if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now, the question comes up, what does that mean, not under bondage? It says, essentially, this unbeliever is not content to stay in this marriage, and they are determined that they are going to leave. He says, let them leave, let them depart, let them divorce you. You're not initiating it, they are. Okay, let that happen. You don't need to, question number 7, What does it mean a brother or sister is not under bondage if an unbelieving mate leaves? What does that mean? Mike, John?
Well, we've been talking about, the sexual purity inside of marriage, and we've been talking about, going back to the beginning of this, as to how your body belongs to that person. And now, you're no longer under bondage in that situation anymore. You have to make sure that happens. That's up to them because they chose.
In the English Standard Version, it says the slave. So in this wording, Paul's saying marriage is not slavery. You weren't a slave to him when you were married. You're not a slave to him in that separation, in that divorce. So basically, I think what he's saying is you don't have, if they go off, you're because of that marriage bond, you don't have to go with them into sin, into worship those household gods or that idolatry that they're going to go after. You don't have to do that. If they want to break that marriage bond, you're not forced to go with them to maintain that godly bond of marriage. They broke it. Unfortunately, you're going to have to live as a single person the rest of your life, and it's unfortunate, but you're not in slavery, so you can stay in a relationship with God.
Right. Ron, do you have more?
Yeah, it's similar. See, when I looked that word up, there are some translations that give you the idea of like a trap or containment, not just that the relationships are bound together and they're contained together as we've been talking about. And that containment is no longer there because they have chose to depart.
Exactly. So, serving the Lord and family relationships don't always go together. Jesus talked about in the household 2 against 3, 3 against 2, things like that. And this could be a case. And the Christian is called to peace. You're faithful to the Lord first and foremost. And if your spouse decides they're not going to have any of that and leave you, well, then you be at peace with that because you served the Lord. You did right. You lived right. You were faithful. You were true. And if they go away, well, then you just can't help that. But I want to emphasize, it's not saying the marriage bond is not there. There's a different word used for that later on in the chapter. It's not talking about the marriage bond is not intact. You still belong to each other, okay? And so you don't have the right to go out, well, I've been abandoned and now I can go marry someone. None of that is in here. And one of the things he says in verse 16, there's 2 ways to people have interpreted 16 just briefly here. One is, you want to try to stay with them to convert them. The other one is you can't chase them down if they want to leave in the hope that they're going to come around eventually because you don't know. So don't compromise thinking, well, later I'll get them to come around. Don't do that.